The jungle exhaled moisture like breath from a fever. Private First Class Daniel Reeves wiped the sweat from his forehead and stared at the river ahead. It looked peaceful, almost inviting. The surface reflected the gray morning sky, broken only by the slow drift of leaves carried downstream. Somewhere behind him, a 5-ton truck idled, its engine rumbling with impatience. The driver wanted to cross. Command wanted them on the other side before nightfall. But Reeves had learned something in his 7 months in Vietnam. He had learned that nothing here was what it appeared to be. The year was 1968. The place was a nameless tributary of the Mekong Delta, one of hundreds that threaded through the Vietnamese landscape like veins through a living body, and like veins, these waterways carried life. But they also carried death. What the American military would come to understand, often too late, was that the rivers of Vietnam were not obstacles to be crossed. They were adversaries to be respected, and for those who failed to do so, they became graves. Reeves watched as the lieutenant waved the first vehicle forward. It was a standard deuce-and-a-half, loaded with supplies for a forward operating base 12 kilometers to the west. The driver revved the engine, the wheels bit into the mud, and the truck lurched toward the water. For the first few meters, everything seemed fine. The water rose to the wheel hubs, then to the doors. The engine strained but held, and then, without warning, the front of the truck dropped. Not tilted, dropped, as if the riverbed had simply ceased to exist beneath it. The driver's scream cut through the humid air. The truck tilted forward at an impossible angle, its rear wheels spinning uselessly in the air for one surreal moment before the entire vehicle slid beneath the surface. Men shouted. Someone threw a rope. But the brown water had already closed over the cab like a mouth swallowing its prey. Bubbles rose for 30 seconds. Then nothing. They would recover the truck 3 days later, using a winch and a recovery vehicle that nearly suffered the same fate. Inside the cab, they found the driver still strapped to his seat, his hands frozen on the steering wheel, his eyes open and staring at nothing. The official report would list the cause of death as drowning, but the men who were there knew better. The river had simply decided to take him, and there was nothing anyone could have done to stop it. This was the reality of riverine warfare in Vietnam, a reality that would claim thousands of vehicles, hundreds of armored personnel carriers, and an unknowable number of men whose bodies were never recovered. The rivers of Vietnam were not passive features of the landscape. They were active participants in the conflict. They shifted. They deceived. They swallowed whatever crossed them without permission. And they did so with an indifference that made even the most hardened soldiers feel small. The Mekong Delta alone contained over 4,000 kilometers of navigable waterways. But the word navigable was misleading. What was navigable in the dry season became impassable in the wet season. What appeared shallow one day could become a 15-foot death trap the next. The riverbeds were not made of solid earth. They were composed of centuries of accumulated silt, decaying vegetation, and what the soldiers called quick mud. A substance that looked solid but behaved like liquid. A substance that could swallow a 30-ton tank in minutes if the conditions were right. The American military had entered Vietnam with confidence born of technological superiority. They had helicopters that could fly over any terrain. They had trucks that could carry supplies across continents. They had tanks that had crushed the Wehrmacht in Europe and the North Korean army on the peninsula. What they did not have was any understanding of hydrology, any respect for the ancient relationship between water and land in Southeast Asia, any comprehension that the rivers they saw on their maps were not fixed features, but living systems that changed with the seasons, the rains, and the tides. The first major vehicle losses to rivers occurred in 1965, during the early buildup of American forces. A convoy of supply trucks attempting to cross the Song Bi River during what appeared to be the dry season lost 4 vehicles in a single afternoon. The river, swollen by unexpected rains in the highlands, had undermined the banks and created a submerged channel that no one could see from the surface. The trucks drove in at the designated crossing point and simply vanished. Recovery operations took 2 weeks and cost another vehicle, But these early losses were dismissed as accidents, as learning experiences, as the cost of operating in unfamiliar terrain. What the military failed to recognize was that these were not accidents. They were warnings. The rivers were teaching a lesson that would take years and thousands of casualties to learn, and by the time that lesson was fully understood, the war would already be lost. Private Reeves stood at the bank of that nameless tributary and watched the bubbles rise from where the truck had disappeared. He was 19 years old. He had grown up in Ohio, where rivers were things you fished in on summer afternoons, where water was something you controlled with dams and levees and bridges built by men who understood engineering. Nothing in his life had prepared him for this, for water that moved with intention, for rivers that seemed to think. He would survive his tour. He would return home to Ohio and spend the rest of his life avoiding bodies of water. He would never speak about what he saw that day, but he would dream about it. For decades, he would dream about brown water closing over a windshield, about a man's hands gripping a steering wheel as the darkness rose around him, about the terrible patience of a river that had been swallowing men for centuries and would continue to do so long after the last American soldier had gone home. The rivers of Vietnam were waiting. They had always been waiting, and they would take everything that was offered to them. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. These are stories the world tried to forget, but someone needs to remember them. Subscribe now so you never miss a single truth. To understand why the rivers of Vietnam became graveyards for American equipment and men, one must first understand what those rivers actually were. Not as lines on a map, not as obstacles in a tactical briefing, but as geological and hydrological systems that had evolved over millions of years to behave in ways that defied Western military assumptions. Vietnam is shaped by water. The country stretches over 1,600 kilometers from north to south, but it is rarely more than 50 kilometers wide at any point. This narrow geography means that nearly every strategic location, every population center, every supply route must cross or follow a waterway. The two dominant river systems, the Red River in the north and the Mekong in the south, create deltas that are among the most complex hydrological environments on Earth. These are not simple rivers with defined banks and predictable flows. They are living labyrinths of channels, tributaries, canals, and flooded plains that change configuration with every season. The Mekong Delta alone covers approximately 40,000 square kilometers. During the dry season, from November to April, much of this area is accessible to vehicles. The water recedes, the ground hardens, roads become passable. But during the wet season, from May to October, the entire region transforms. The Mekong rises by as much as 10 meters. The tributaries overflow their banks. The distinction between land and water disappears. What was a road becomes a canal. What was a field becomes a lake. And what was a shallow crossing point becomes a death trap. The American military learned this lesson through repetition. In 1966, the 3rd Marine Division lost an entire mechanized patrol to a river crossing near Da Nang. The unit had crossed the same river 3 weeks earlier without incident. But the monsoon had arrived. The river had risen 4 meters. And the riverbed, which had been firm gravel in the dry season, had become a treacherous mixture of sand and clay that offered no support. The first armored personnel carrier made it halfway across before it began to sink. The second attempted to tow it out and was pulled in. The third tried to retreat and found that the bank behind it had already collapsed into the water. All 3 vehicles were lost. 11 men drowned. The geology of Vietnamese riverbeds was unlike anything American engineers had encountered. In temperate climates, riverbeds tend to be composed of rock, gravel, or compacted sand. They provide stable foundations for crossing, but in Vietnam, centuries of tropical weathering had created riverbeds of laterite clay, organic silt, and what geologists call flocculated sediment. These materials behave like solids under static conditions, but liquefy under pressure. When a heavy vehicle enters the water and presses down on the riverbed, the sediment loses its structure. It flows. And it does not flow back. This phenomenon, which the soldiers called getting sucked down, was responsible for hundreds of vehicle losses. A truck or tank would enter a river at what appeared to be a safe crossing point. The water would be shallow, perhaps waist deep. The driver would proceed confidently, and then, within seconds, the vehicle would begin to sink. Not because the water was deep, but because the riverbed beneath the vehicle was not solid. It was a suspension of particles that could support a walking man, but not a 20-ton truck. The quick mud was particularly deadly because it gave no warning. Unlike quicksand, which has visible characteristics, quick mud looked exactly like firm bottom. It reflected light the same way. It felt solid under a probing stick. Only when significant weight was applied did it reveal its true nature. And by then, escape was often impossible. Recovery operations for vehicles lost to quick mud were extraordinarily difficult. The suction created by the liquefied sediment was immense. A 5-ton truck could require 50 tons of pulling force to extract, and even then, the recovery vehicles themselves were at risk. In some cases, the military simply abandoned the lost equipment, marking the locations on maps as no-go zones. Over the course of the war, hundreds of vehicles were left in Vietnamese rivers, their hulks slowly sinking deeper into the sediment until they disappeared entirely. But the rivers presented other dangers as well. The water itself was often toxic. Decades of agricultural runoff, combined with the natural decay of tropical vegetation, created waterways rich in bacteria, parasites, and organic toxins. Soldiers who entered the water, even briefly, risked infections that could incapacitate or kill. Leptospirosis, a bacterial disease transmitted through water contaminated with animal urine, affected thousands of American troops. The symptoms began with fever and headache, but could progress to liver failure, kidney damage, and death. The rivers also harbored snakes. Vietnam is home to dozens of venomous species, many of which are aquatic or semi-aquatic. The banded krait, the Malayan pit viper, and the king cobra all frequented riverine environments. Soldiers crossing rivers or wading through flooded terrain faced the constant risk of snake bite. And in the chaos of a river crossing, with vehicles sinking and men struggling to stay afloat, a snake attack could go unnoticed until the venom had already begun its work. The tides added another layer of complexity. In the Mekong Delta, tidal influence extends more than 200 kilometers inland. This meant that water levels could change dramatically within hours, even without rainfall. A crossing that was safe at low tide could become impossible at high tide. And the timing of the tides was not always predictable. The interaction between river flow, tidal surge, and monsoon flooding created hydraulic conditions that even experienced navigators found challenging. The Americans tried to adapt. They brought in amphibious vehicles designed for beach landings and river crossings. But these vehicles, optimized for European conditions, struggled in the Vietnamese environment. Their hulls were designed for water, not mud. Their propellers fouled on underwater vegetation. Their engines overheated in the tropical humidity. The LVTP, the primary amphibious vehicle of the Marine Corps, proved particularly vulnerable. Its flat bottom was efficient in water, but created enormous suction when it touched soft mud. Dozens of LVTPs were lost in the Mekong Delta alone. The Army experimented with portable bridges and floating causeways. But these solutions required time, equipment, and security that were often unavailable. Setting up a portable bridge could take hours, and during those hours, the construction site became a target for enemy mortars and snipers who knew exactly where the Americans would be. Many bridge operations were abandoned under fire, leaving the equipment, and sometimes the engineers, behind. What the Americans never fully grasped was that the Vietnamese had been navigating these waters for millennia. They knew which crossings were safe in which seasons. They knew how to read the color of the water, the behavior of the fish, the patterns of the vegetation. They moved in small boats and on foot, using routes that heavy vehicles could never follow. And they used this knowledge as a weapon. They deliberately led American patrols toward treacherous crossings. They mined the approaches to known fording points. They waited for convoys to become trapped in the water and then attacked from prepared positions. The rivers of Vietnam were not neutral ground. They belonged to the land. They belonged to the people who had lived with them for generations. And they did not welcome the machines of war that tried to cross them by force. The date was March 17, 1969. The location was Route 19, the main supply artery connecting the coastal city of Quy Nhon to the Central Highlands. It was a road that American logistics depended on. A road that had been built by the French and improved by the Americans. A road that crossed 17 rivers and streams in its 100-kilometer length. And it was on this road, at a crossing point designated Bridge 14, that one of the most devastating single losses of the war would occur. The convoy consisted of 32 vehicles, 15 cargo trucks carrying ammunition and food supplies, 8 fuel tankers, 6 armored personnel carriers providing security, 2 recovery vehicles, and 1 command jeep carrying Captain Marcus Webb, the convoy commander. Webb was 34 years old, a career officer from Virginia who had served 2 previous tours in Vietnam. He knew the roads, he knew the risks, and he knew that Route 19 was dangerous even on the best of days. The convoy departed Quy Nhon at 0400 hours, before dawn. The plan was to cross the rivers during the early morning, when water levels were typically at their lowest. Webb had studied the weather reports. There had been no significant rainfall in the past week. The rivers should have been manageable, but weather reports in Vietnam were notoriously unreliable. They measured rainfall at specific locations. They could not account for what was happening in the mountains. And in the mountains, the monsoon had arrived early. The first 3 crossings went smoothly. The water was high but passable. The trucks splashed through without incident. Webb began to relax. He radioed ahead to the next checkpoint, reporting progress and estimated arrival time. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed routine. Bridge 14 was not actually a bridge. It was a ford, a place where the river widened and grew shallow enough for vehicles to cross. The original French bridge had been destroyed in 1954 and never rebuilt. The Americans had reinforced the approaches with gravel and installed markers indicating the safest path. Under normal conditions, the crossing took about 3 minutes per vehicle. Under normal conditions. When the convoy arrived at Bridge 14, Webb immediately knew something was wrong. The water was moving faster than he had ever seen it. The surface was brown and churning, carrying debris from upstream. The crossing markers were barely visible above the waterline. He ordered the convoy to halt and walked to the river's edge with his sergeant. The sergeant was a man named Thomas Holloway, a 26-year-old from Louisiana who had grown up on the bayous and knew water better than most. Holloway looked at the river for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "We need to wait," he said. "This water is running too fast. There's something happening upstream. Something big." Webb faced a decision. Waiting meant delays. Delays meant that the supplies would not reach their destination on time. Delays meant questions from headquarters. Delays meant that his record, which was spotless, would be tarnished. He looked at the river. He looked at the markers. He looked at his watch. "We go," he said. "One vehicle at a time. Slow and steady." The first truck entered the water without incident. The driver, an experienced corporal who had made this crossing a dozen times, picked his way carefully through the current. The water rose to his running boards, but no higher. He reached the far bank, pulled out, and signaled all clear. The second truck followed, then the third. By the 10th vehicle, Webb was confident they had made the right decision. The 11th vehicle was a fuel tanker carrying 3,000 gallons of diesel. It was heavier than the cargo trucks. It sat lower in the water, and when it reached the midpoint of the crossing, where the current was strongest, something changed. The driver felt the rear of the tanker begin to swing. The current had caught the broadside of the tank and was pushing it downstream. He tried to correct. He accelerated to regain control, and in doing so, he drove off the prepared path and into deeper water. The tanker did not sink immediately. It floated. Diesel fuel is lighter than water, and the sealed tank acted as a buoy. But the current was relentless. It pushed the tanker sideways, then downstream. The driver tried to steer back toward the bank, but the wheels were no longer touching bottom. He was adrift. Webb watched in horror as the tanker picked up speed. The driver was screaming into his radio. The men on the bank were shouting. Someone threw a rope that fell short. And then the tanker hit a submerged obstruction, some buried rock or debris that no one had known was there. The impact tore a hole in the tank. Diesel began to pour into the water. The tanker lost buoyancy, and within 60 seconds, it had rolled onto its side and begun to sink. The driver escaped. He climbed out the window and swam for the bank, fighting the current with desperate strength. But the tanker was gone. 3,000 gallons of fuel were spreading across the river, creating a slick that would contaminate the water supply for kilometers downstream. Webb ordered the convoy to hold position. He radioed for assistance. He tried to assess the situation. And that was when the real disaster began. The rain started without warning. Not a gentle rain. Not a tropical shower. A wall of water that fell from the sky with the force of a fire hose. Visibility dropped to near zero. The men could barely see the vehicle in front of them. And the river, already swollen, began to rise. What happened next occurred over approximately 45 minutes, though it felt like hours to those who survived. The water rose so fast that vehicles could not retreat. The approaches to the ford, which had been above water when the convoy arrived, were now submerged. The trucks that had not yet crossed were trapped between the river ahead and the flooded road behind. And the trucks that had crossed were trapped on the far bank, unable to turn around on the narrow road. The first vehicle to be lost on the approach was an armored personnel carrier. Its driver, trying to back away from the rising water, drove off the edge of the gravel and into the soft mud beside the road. The APC sank to its turret ring in less than 2 minutes. The crew escaped through the top hatch, but the vehicle was gone. The second loss was a cargo truck that was simply swept away. The water rose around it, lifted it off its wheels, and carried it downstream. The driver jumped out and was pulled under by the current. His body would be found 2 kilometers downstream 3 days later. By the time the rain stopped, the convoy had lost 12 vehicles, 3 fuel tankers, 4 cargo trucks, 2 armored personnel carriers, 2 recovery vehicles, and the command jeep, which had been swept away with Captain Webb still inside. Webb survived. He was thrown clear when the jeep rolled and managed to grab a tree branch that saved his life. But 7 men died that day. 7 men whose names would be added to the long list of those killed not by enemy fire, but by the rivers of Vietnam. The official investigation determined that the disaster was caused by a flash flood originating in the mountains 30 kilometers upstream. A cloudburst had dumped an estimated 15 centimeters of rain in less than an hour. The runoff had funneled into the river and created a surge that reached Bridge 14 just as the convoy was attempting to cross. The timing was catastrophic. The luck was non-existent. But luck had nothing to do with it. The rivers of Vietnam did not operate on luck. They operated on physics, hydrology, and the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The Vietnamese knew that March was the beginning of the transition season. They knew that mountain storms could send floods down the valleys without warning. They knew that Route 19 was dangerous precisely because it crossed so many waterways. And they knew that sooner or later, the rivers would claim their due. Captain Webb returned home after his tour. He received no commendation for the disaster. He received no blame either. The war had too many disasters for any single one to stand out. But he never forgot that day. He never forgot the sound of the water rising, the screams of the men who were swept away, the terrible helplessness of watching the river take everything he had been responsible for. If you are feeling what those soldiers felt, if their story is touching something inside you, leave a comment right now saying, "The river remembers what we tried to forget." Let me know that you understand. Let me know that these stories matter to you. The American military did not accept defeat easily. When it became clear that the rivers of Vietnam were claiming unacceptable numbers of vehicles and men, the response was characteristic of American industrial thinking. Build better machines, develop new technology, engineer solutions to problems that other armies simply avoided. It was an approach that had won wars in Europe and the Pacific. It was an approach that would prove largely futile in the waterways of Southeast Asia. The first major technological response was the deployment of specialized amphibious vehicles. The M113 armored personnel carrier, the workhorse of American mechanized warfare, was not designed for deep water operations. Its aluminum hull was buoyant, but barely so. In calm water, it could swim at approximately 5 kilometers per hour. But in the rivers of Vietnam, with their currents and debris and unpredictable depths, the M113 was vulnerable. Its bilge pumps could not keep up with water intrusion from damaged seals. Its tracks, effective on land, provided minimal propulsion in water, and its low freeboard meant that even moderate waves could swamp it. The solution was the M113A1, an upgraded version with improved sealing, a more powerful engine, and a trim vane that could be raised to deflect water away from the bow. The military also developed flotation kits, essentially inflatable bladders that attached to the sides of the vehicle and increased its buoyancy. These modifications helped. They reduced the loss rate, but they did not eliminate it. The rivers continued to claim M113s throughout the war. For heavier vehicles, the military turned to the M88 recovery vehicle, a 50-ton behemoth designed to tow disabled tanks. The M88 was powerful enough to extract vehicles from almost any situation. But it had a critical weakness. It was not amphibious. It could not enter deep water without drowning its engine. And in the rivers of Vietnam, the places where vehicles needed to be recovered were often the places where the M88 could not go. The Army experimented with extending the M88's reach using cables and pulleys. They developed anchor systems that could be driven into the riverbanks to provide stable pulling points. They trained recovery crews in underwater operations, equipping them with diving gear and cutting equipment. But every recovery operation was dangerous. The currents could pull divers under. The mud could trap them. The cables could snap under tension and kill anyone in their path. Recovery crews suffered casualty rates that rivaled infantry units. The most ambitious technological response was the development of specialized river crossing equipment. The Army brought in M4T6 floating bridges, modular systems that could be assembled in hours to create crossings over rivers up to 100 meters wide. These bridges were engineering marvels. They could support vehicles up to 70 tons. They could be raised or lowered to accommodate changing water levels. They were designed to withstand currents of up to 8 knots. But the rivers of Vietnam did not cooperate. The floating bridges required stable banks for anchoring. Vietnamese riverbanks were often soft mud that could not hold the anchor points. The bridges required calm water for assembly. Vietnamese rivers were rarely calm. The bridges required security during the hours of construction. Vietnamese guerrillas specifically targeted bridge-building operations because they knew exactly where the Americans would be and for how long. In 1967, the Army attempted to establish a permanent floating bridge across the Perfume River near Hue. The construction took 3 weeks. The bridge was destroyed by enemy sappers on its second night of operation. It was rebuilt. It was destroyed again. After the fourth destruction, the military abandoned the project. The Navy contributed its own technological solutions. The Riverine Assault Force, established in 1967, deployed a fleet of specialized boats designed for operations in the Mekong Delta. These included monitors, heavily armored boats mounting cannons and flamethrowers, assault support patrol boats, command and communication boats. The fleet was impressive on paper. Dozens of vessels capable of projecting power deep into the waterways. But the boats faced challenges that no amount of armor could overcome. They drew too much water for the shallow channels. They were too slow to pursue the sampans that the enemy used. They were too loud to achieve surprise. And they were vulnerable to mines, which the Viet Cong planted in abundance throughout the Delta's waterways. The mines were simple but effective. Pressure-detonated devices triggered by the weight of a passing hull, command-detonated bombs set off by watchers hidden in the vegetation along the banks, floating mines that drifted with the current until they found a target. The Riverine fleet lost dozens of boats to mines. The crews lived in constant fear, knowing that every meter of waterway could conceal their death. The military also attempted to control the rivers through chemical means. The infamous Agent Orange defoliation program was partly motivated by the need to clear vegetation from riverbanks and canal sides. The dense jungle that grew along the waterways provided perfect cover for ambushes. By killing the vegetation, the military hoped to deny the enemy their concealment. The program worked in a narrow tactical sense. The defoliated zones did improve visibility. They did reduce the frequency of ambushes. But the cost was catastrophic. The chemicals poisoned the water, killing fish that local populations depended on for food. They contaminated the soil, making agriculture impossible for decades. They sickened American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians alike, causing cancers and birth defects that continue to this day. And they did nothing to address the fundamental problem. The rivers themselves remained as dangerous as ever. Perhaps the most telling technological failure was the hovercraft program. In theory, hovercraft were the perfect solution for Vietnamese waterways. They could travel over water, mud, vegetation, and land with equal ease. They were fast, maneuverable, and immune to mines because they did not touch the surface. The military acquired a fleet of PACV hovercraft and deployed them with high expectations. The results were disappointing. The hovercraft were incredibly loud, announcing their presence from kilometers away. They were vulnerable to small arms fire, which could puncture their skirts and disable them. They consumed enormous quantities of fuel, limiting their range, and they could not operate in the dense vegetation that covered much of the delta. A single tree branch could bring a hovercraft to a halt. By 1970, the hovercraft program had been quietly discontinued. The machines had been defeated not by enemy action, but by the environment itself. The lesson that emerged from all these technological efforts was humbling. The rivers of Vietnam could not be conquered by machines. They could not be engineered into submission. They could only be respected, understood, and when possible, avoided. It was a lesson that ran counter to everything the American military believed about its own capabilities, and it was a lesson that would take years and thousands of casualties to learn. The Vietnamese, watching from their hiding places along the banks, understood what the Americans did not. They understood that the rivers were not obstacles to be overcome. They were allies to be honored. They were weapons to be wielded. And they would continue to serve those who knew their secrets long after the foreigners and their machines had gone. The statistics are sterile. They reduce human tragedy to numbers, to percentages, to columns in a report. But behind every statistic was a person, a name, a face, a family that waited for a letter that would never come or, worse, received the letter they had always dreaded. The rivers of Vietnam claimed men in ways that left no graves to visit, no bodies to bury, no certainty that death had actually occurred. The official records list approximately 2,000 American service members as missing in action in Vietnam. Many of these were aviators shot down over enemy territory, their fates unknown. But a significant number, perhaps several hundred, were lost to the rivers and waterways. Men who went into the water and never came out. Men whose remains were never recovered because they sank into mud that would not release them. Men who simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions that their families would carry for the rest of their lives. Sergeant Michael Torres was one of these men. He was 23 years old, from a small town in New Mexico, the eldest of 5 children. He had enlisted because he believed it was his duty, because his father had served in Korea and his grandfather in World War II. He arrived in Vietnam in January of 1968, assigned to a transportation company responsible for moving supplies through the Mekong Delta. Torres was a good soldier. His evaluations were excellent. His commanding officers praised his reliability, his calm under pressure, his ability to keep vehicles running in conditions that destroyed lesser machines. He had a gift for mechanics, an intuitive understanding of engines and systems that made him invaluable. He was the man others called when a truck would not start, when a boat's motor died, when equipment that should have worked simply refused to. On the night of April 14, 1968, Torres was part of a convoy attempting a night crossing of a tributary of the Bassac River. The crossing was necessary because the road had been cut by enemy forces, and the only alternative route required traversing the waterway. The convoy commander had decided to attempt the crossing at night, hoping that darkness would provide concealment from potential ambushers. The crossing went wrong almost immediately. The lead vehicle entered the water at the wrong angle and became stuck on a submerged obstacle. Torres was called forward to help. He waded into the river with a cable, intending to attach it to the stuck vehicle so it could be winched out. The water was chest deep and cold. The current was stronger than expected. Torres reached the vehicle, attached the cable, and signaled for the winch to begin. What happened next was never fully reconstructed. The accounts from survivors conflict. Some said the cable snapped. Others said the stuck vehicle suddenly shifted and knocked Torres under. Still others said he simply lost his footing and was pulled away by the current. All that is certain is that Torres went under the water and did not come back up. The search began immediately. Men with flashlights waded into the river calling his name. The convoy halted for 6 hours while the search continued. At dawn, a helicopter arrived to assist. They searched for 3 days. They found nothing. Not a body, not a piece of equipment, not a shred of evidence that Michael Torres had ever existed. His family was notified that he was missing in action. For months, they clung to hope. Perhaps he had been captured. Perhaps he had washed ashore somewhere and was making his way back to friendly lines. Perhaps there had been a mistake in the records. But the months became years, and the years became decades, and hope slowly transformed into acceptance. Michael Torres was gone. The river had taken him, and it would not give him back. His mother, Elena Torres, spent the rest of her life writing letters to the military, asking for information, to politicians, demanding answers, to other families of the missing, sharing grief and purpose. She traveled to Washington and stood at the Vietnam Memorial, running her fingers over her son's name etched in black stone. She never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, his remains might be found and returned home. She died in 2004, still waiting. Stories like this were replicated hundreds of times. The soldier who fell from a boat during a firefight and was pulled under by his equipment. The driver who drowned when his truck rolled in a river crossing. The engineer who was swept away while trying to repair a damaged bridge. The medic who jumped into the water to save a wounded man and drowned alongside him. Each death was individual. Each death was a universe of grief for someone. The psychological toll on survivors was equally devastating. The men who watched their comrades disappear into the water, who felt the helplessness of being unable to save them, carried that trauma forever. Many developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about drowning. They avoided water in any form. They lived with guilt that had no rational basis but felt as real as the mud that had swallowed their friends. Corporal James Anderson returned from Vietnam in 1970. He had served 18 months in the Mekong Delta, operating patrol boats and conducting riverine operations. He had seen men die in dozens of ways, but the deaths that haunted him were the drownings, the faces of men going under, the hands reaching up from the water, the bubbles that marked where a life had ended. Anderson could not sleep near water. The sound of a river or even a stream triggered panic attacks that left him shaking and unable to function. He moved to the desert, to Arizona, to a place where water was scarce and rivers were mostly dry beds of sand. But even there, the memories followed him. In his dreams, the rivers of Vietnam were always full, always flowing, always hungry. He sought help from the Veterans Administration, but in the 1970s, the psychological wounds of war were poorly understood and poorly treated. He was told to be strong, to move on, to focus on the future rather than the past. These platitudes did nothing. The rivers did not care about the future. They existed in an eternal present, waiting for him every time he closed his eyes. Anderson eventually found some peace through a support group of fellow veterans, men who had experienced similar traumas, men who understood without explanation. They met weekly, sharing stories that they could not share with anyone else. They spoke of the water, of the mud, of the friends they had lost. And in the speaking, some of the burden was lifted, not removed, never removed, but made bearable. The Vietnamese people suffered even more. For them, the rivers had always been sources of life, the arteries of their civilization. But during the war, the rivers became killing grounds. Fishermen were caught in crossfires. Villages along the waterways were destroyed by bombs and artillery. Children playing in the shallows stepped on unexploded ordnance and lost limbs or lives. The water that had sustained generations became poisoned with chemicals and blood. After the war ended, the rivers slowly healed. The vegetation grew back. The fish returned. The water cleared. But the memories did not fade. The people who lived along the waterways passed down stories of what had happened there. They showed their children the rusted hulks of American vehicles that still protruded from the water in some places. They explained that these were monuments to a time of madness, when foreigners had come with their machines and tried to conquer the rivers, and the rivers had won. The cost of that victory was measured in lives, American lives, Vietnamese lives, lives that could never be recovered, never be redeemed. The rivers had taken them all, without distinction, without mercy, and they would keep them forever. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March of 1973. The helicopters lifted off from Saigon, carrying men who were eager to leave and desperate to forget. Behind them, they left a country in ruins, cities destroyed, villages burned, forests defoliated, and rivers that still held the wreckage of a decade of war. In the years that followed, the Vietnamese worked to reclaim their waterways. They dredged the channels, they removed the debris, they rebuilt the bridges and repaired the dikes. The rivers, resilient as always, cooperated. They carried away the silt and sediment. They flushed the toxins from their systems. They returned slowly to something approximating their pre-war state. But the scars remained. In some places, the riverbeds were still littered with unexploded ordnance, bombs and shells that had failed to detonate but remained deadly. Fishermen hauling their nets occasionally brought up grenades or mines instead of fish. Children diving for mollusks found artillery shells embedded in the mud. Even decades after the war ended, the rivers continued to claim victims, people killed by the weapons that had been left behind. The Vietnamese government estimates that since 1975, more than 40,000 people have been killed by unexploded ordnance in the country. Many of these deaths occurred along waterways, where bombs and shells had sunk into the mud and waited for decades to fulfill their purpose. The rivers had become time capsules of violence, releasing their contents unpredictably and without warning. For the American veterans who returned, the legacy was equally complex. Many struggled to reintegrate into a society that did not understand what they had experienced and, in many cases, did not want to know. The Vietnam War was unpopular. The veterans were treated with indifference or hostility. Their sacrifices were minimized. Their traumas were ignored. They were told to be quiet, to move on, to stop dwelling on the past. But the past would not release them. The rivers of Vietnam had carved channels in their memories that would never fully heal. They saw the water in their dreams. They felt the mud pulling at their boots. They heard the screams of men who had gone under and never come up. These memories were as real to them as anything in their present lives, and they carried them until the end. Some veterans returned to Vietnam decades later, seeking closure or understanding. They traveled to the places where they had served, stood on the banks of rivers they had once feared, and tried to reconcile the memories with the reality. In many cases, they found that the rivers had changed. The war was over. The water flowed peacefully. The people who lived along the banks welcomed them, not as enemies, but as fellow survivors of a catastrophe that had affected everyone. James Morrison was one of these returning veterans. He had served as a lieutenant in the Riverine Forces in 1969, commanding a patrol boat that had operated throughout the Mekong Delta. He had lost 3 men under his command, all of them to the water. One had been shot and fallen overboard. One had drowned when their boat was sunk by a mine. One had simply disappeared during a night patrol, vanishing into the darkness without a trace. Morrison returned to Vietnam in 2010, 40 years after his service. He hired a guide and traveled to the places where he had operated. He stood on the bank of the river where his boat had been sunk and looked at the water that had taken his men. He did not know what he expected to feel. Anger, perhaps. Grief. Some sense of resolution. What he felt was emptiness. The river did not remember. The river did not care. The river simply flowed, as it had flowed for millennia, carrying water and sediment and whatever debris fell into it toward the sea. His men were part of that flow now, their atoms scattered throughout the delta, mixed with the mud and the water and the endless cycle of erosion and deposition. They were gone, but they were also everywhere. The river had absorbed them. Morrison stood there for a long time, watching the water. Then he knelt and scooped up a handful of mud from the bank. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its coolness, its essential indifference. Then he let it fall back into the water and watched it disperse. He never returned to Vietnam again. But he spoke about his experience in the years that followed, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. He spoke at schools, at veterans groups, at memorial ceremonies. He wanted people to understand what the rivers had meant, what they had taken, what they had taught. He wanted the sacrifice of his men to be remembered. The rivers of Vietnam are still there. They still flow through the deltas and valleys, carrying water from the mountains to the sea. They still flood in the wet season and recede in the dry season. They still support millions of people who depend on them for food, transportation, and irrigation. They are essential to life in Vietnam, as they have always been. But they are also monuments, silent witnesses to a conflict that killed millions and changed the world. Every drop of water that flows through them carries traces of that history, molecules that were once part of men and machines, chemicals that were sprayed from aircraft, sediments that were churned by bombs and battles. The rivers remember, even if they do not understand. They hold the history within them, flowing endlessly toward the sea. The lessons of those rivers extend beyond Vietnam. They speak to the hubris of technological confidence, the assumption that machines can overcome any obstacle, that engineering can solve any problem. They speak to the limits of military power, the reality that some terrain cannot be conquered, only respected. They speak to the human cost of war, the lives lost not in glorious combat but in moments of chaos and confusion, swallowed by forces that no one could control. And they speak to memory itself. The rivers are still flowing. The war is still being fought, in the dreams of veterans, in the unexploded ordnance that still kills, in the environmental damage that still lingers. The water moves on, but it carries the past with it, mixing it with the present, depositing it in new places, ensuring that nothing is ever truly forgotten. Private Daniel Reeves, who watched a truck disappear into a river on a morning in 1968, is an old man now. He lives in a small house in Ohio, far from any significant body of water. He has grandchildren who know nothing of Vietnam, who have never heard of the Mekong Delta or Route 19 or Bridge 14. He has never told them. Some memories are too heavy to pass on, but sometimes, late at night, he sits in his chair and closes his eyes, and he sees the brown water, the rising bubbles, the hands on the steering wheel, the terrible patience of a river that took everything offered to it and asked for nothing in return. He sees it as clearly as he saw it 50 years ago. The river is still there, inside him, flowing through his memory, carrying its secrets toward a destination he cannot name. The rivers of Vietnam swallowed trucks, tanks, and men. They swallowed hope and confidence and the illusion of control. They swallowed a generation of young men who went to war believing they could not be stopped and discovered that the water did not care what they believed. And they are still swallowing, still flowing, still waiting for whatever comes next. Some truths cannot be taught. They can only be experienced. The men who crossed those rivers, who felt the mud pull at their boots, who watched the water close over their comrades, learned a truth that no textbook could convey. They learned that nature is not a backdrop to human conflict. It is a participant. It has its own agenda, its own timeline, its own indifference to human suffering. And in the rivers of Vietnam, that indifference was written in brown water and churned sediment, and the silence that followed every loss. The war is over. The rivers remain. And for those who listen carefully, they can still hear the echoes of what happened there, carried on the current, flowing toward the sea, disappearing into history but never quite gone. If you watched this far, it is because you understand. It is because these stories matter to you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. If this story touched something inside you, hit the like button. It helps more people discover these forgotten truths. And if you know someone who should hear this story, share it with them. Some histories should never be lost. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. The rivers of Vietnam have been waiting decades for someone to tell their story. Subscribe now and make sure you are here for the next one. The water remembers. And now, so do you.